So I just wanted to, my name is Pooja Lagasetti. I'm one of the Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholars here and also a member of the IHPI. And I wanted to welcome and introduce Professor Prabhakaran. So Professor Prabhakaran is currently the director for the Center for Chronic Diseases and Injuries and the vice president of the Public Health Foundation of India. He's a cardiologist and epidemiologist by training and graduated from the Bangalore Medical College and went on to receive his MD and DM degrees from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. He has a master's in science and research methodology from McMaster in Canada, and he's also a professor of epidemiology at the Public Health Foundation of India and has appointments at the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, and is also an adjunct professor at the Emory Rowland School of Public Health. He was a former professor of cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and his medical research has since largely been revolving around assessing cardiovascular disease risk factors in India and also using translational research to develop solutions for prevention and control. He's participated in many major international research studies, including the Inner Heart Study, and he has been funded by many national and international agencies, including the WHO, the NIH, the British Heart Foundation, and the Wellcome Trust. And in a span of over 15 years, he's mentored over 40 pre-doctoral, postdoctoral, and junior faculty who have also become leaders in their own rights. He's served on the editorial board of multiple journals, including the Global Health, and last but certainly not least, he's been published and authored at over 250 scholarly papers in multiple journals, including the Lancet, BMJ, Nature, and the New England Journal. Now, this is just like a very abbreviated version of his many accolades, and so we're, Professor Prabhakaran, we're very happy to have you here and would like to extend a warm welcome.
Thank you, Pooja, for that very kind introduction. My mother is no more, but she would have been proud of what I have been doing. I feel really humbled by that introduction. So what I'm going to do, first of all, thanks to Raghu and Vineet for inviting me to give this talk and being here. And it's been very exciting. And I've enjoyed the first half of the morning. I had lots of meetings, and it's great. So there are several things that need to be done to reduce cardiovascular disease burden in any country. And I'm going to share some of the experiences that we have had in India. Although this is an India-focused talk, there are lots of lessons for everyone in terms of what can be done. And I would also like to learn from you in terms of how to improve upon what we are doing in India. So in terms of what my talk is going to be, I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis of cardiovascular disease in India. The research response to the WHO 25-25 goals, which has actually given us a roadmap on how to reduce chronic diseases across the world, and some of the innovations that we're using to generate evidence for CVD prevention and control in India. Now, if I have to summarize the scenario of cardiovascular disease in India, we all know that it afflicts younger population as compared to the Western countries. Indeed, it is said that Indians acquire cardiovascular disease 10 years before their Western counterparts, and several studies have shown that. The second thing is we have special predilection for cardiovascular disease, some cancers, and certain risk factors, particularly diabetes. India was dubbed as the capital of diabetes, diabetes capital of the world, but China has taken over that now. There's substantial heterogeneity in disease patterns in India. India is a large country, and there are certain pockets like in the northeast of India where stroke rates are very high, and they're very similar to the Chinese stroke rates, hemorrhagic strokes, etc. When you go down south, the high rates of diabetes, high rates of coronary artery disease, and they have mostly diabetic dyslipidemia. When you go to the north of India, the lipids are generally like the Western pattern, and coronary artery disease again is high, but diabetes is relatively, very relatively lower than the South Indian population. There's enormous loss of lives in productive years of age, and this results in economic losses. There is a terminology that's been coined recently by Steve Leader and his colleagues from Earth Institute. They call it the potentially productive years of lives lost. Suppose somebody dies at 35 years, and if you think the productive years is still 64 years, nearly 30 years of life is lost. So it is estimated that the potentially productive years of lives that would be lost in India in 2030 will be more than the potentially productive years of lives lost in US, China, Russia, South Africa, and Portugal put together. So that's the number of lives which are lost at that age. Once people acquire disease, they die, and they die much more in India. There's high case fatality in the long term, and there are several reasons to this: unaffordability, higher risk, compliance issues, and many unexplored reasons for this high case fatality. Then there's a lot of rural to urban migration that goes on, and indeed new slums are formed by rural migrants in most of the cities. But even though they are very poor, they acquire urban level risk factors within years of migration, and these have been shown very elegantly by Shah Ibrahim and colleagues who did the urban Indian migration study. And there's reversal of social gradient for risk factors in some settings. By this I mean that everywhere in the world, cardiovascular disease was considered a disease of the rich, and in some places it was considered as a disease of the rich countries and rich amongst the poor countries. But we know that it's reversed in the United States for the last 20 to 30 years. It's poor people who are afflicted more by cardiovascular disease. But in India, you see a mixed pattern. Tobacco usage is very high amongst the poor. Hypertension, there's no difference between the poor and the rich. But for diabetes and obesity, it's still the preserve of the rich as compared to the poor. So, given this summary, what are the challenges and opportunities that we face in terms of reducing cardiovascular disease in India? Let's look at some of the challenges. The first, of course, is the high burden, that we have a huge burden. How do we tackle this? The second is the premature mortality and case fatality. The third is a whole lot of health system challenges: lack of healthcare providers, inadequate healthcare providers, differential distribution of healthcare providers in urban and rural populations, issue of access, availability, distribution of drugs, so many and so on and so forth. I'll talk about that briefly. So I mentioned lack of access, high cost of care. In fact, it's a high out-of-pocket expenditure because the insurance for healthcare is very, very primitive in India. Only around 15% of people have insurance in India. 85% of the care is out-of-pocket. There's a huge amount of information asymmetry, and it's a very patriarchal healthcare. So patients come and say that, doctor, you decide whatever has to be done, we'll go by it. So there's huge amount of power in the hands of the doctor, and there's a lot of information asymmetry. There's emphasis on curative care or prevention, out-of-pocket expenditure I mentioned, insufficient human resources, and all of these lead to huge health disparities in India. So there are various dimensions of disparities in healthcare in India, and I would classify it as 3 A's: awareness, access, and affordability. In terms of awareness, there's lower education. The number of graduates in India is actually just around 15% or so. It's just gone up a little to that extent in the last 10 years, but it's pretty low. Most of the education is still the 12th grade, and of course nearly 30–40% of the people are illiterate. So there's low levels of education, which results in information asymmetry, and as well as lack of awareness results in the fact that poor people actually fare worse in recognition of risk factor. The awareness is very low. Then there is a low level of access and low level of availability because there are inadequately trained doctors at primary care, and the care is provided largely by untrained doctors or alternate systems of medicine. And because of this, there's high morbidity and mortality from simple illnesses. Affordability is an issue. There's insufficient funding of public sector, and the private sector is very expensive. Because of this, there's high out-of-pocket expenditure and illness-driven poverty. In fact, people getting into poverty line, it's estimated that acute illnesses is the third most important cause of why people get into poverty. This is just to show the distribution of physicians. This is a study which we are doing in a small city in North India. Do I have a pointer? No pointer? Okay. So these are trained doctors, and these doctors are present. I mean, this is for a population of 100,000, so you have these many trained doctors. But look at the number of untrained doctors who are providing care. It's almost 2 to 3 times the number of trained doctors. And they are all catering to the lower socioeconomic status. You can see this figure, the high socioeconomic status area, where there are none of these untrained doctors. The trained doctors give care here, and the untrained doctors give care to poor patients. So again, one reason for disparity. So these are the challenges, but we have tremendous opportunity. Historically, the UN met only for the second time to address a health issue. The first time it met was in 1994, I think, for HIV/AIDS. And that actually catapulted HIV into a different orbit. PEPFAR funding came, and a lot of efforts were made to reduce HIV. So recognizing that chronic disease have become a big epidemic or a pandemic, the UN met in September 2011 to identify methods to reduce the burden. It adopted a political resolution and set a target that the NCD-related mortality below 70 years, what is called as premature mortality, should be reduced by 25% by the year 2025. And this is called the 25 by 25 goals. And so the WHO adopted this and gave us several ways of handling this, several ways of reducing it, and they had 9 targets. The first of which was to get essential NCD medicines and technologies to 80% coverage, then drug therapy and counseling at 50% coverage, halting the rise of diabetes and obesity, raising blood pressure by 25%, tobacco use by 30%, salt or sodium intake by 30%, physical inactivity by 10%, and harmful use of alcohol by 10%. Evidently looks very easy, but these are too complex. It's beyond the domain of the doctors and the health worker group, and it requires a multidisciplinary approach. So let me tell what is needed and how we are trying to do this. So what is needed is, one is implementation of known evidence. We know from Western societies that there's been 50% reduction in cardiovascular disease over the last 50 years, and in some countries like UK, in fact, it goes up to almost 80%. That's the figure they have. And these have come not large because of the advances in terms of interventional cardiology, but it has come, that's played a role, but not a major role. The major role has been played by non-personal policy interventions, and actually getting people to get simple drugs that are extremely useful in reducing mortality and morbidity. The second thing that we need to do is contextualization of these evidences. We cannot transplant some evidence which is found in, say, US or in another country to a country like India, and we may end up in failure. I'll give you an example. Bogota is the capital of Colombia, and they were the forerunners in bus rapid transport system to reduce pollution and improve transport. Nearly 80% of the population uses bus rapid transport, and it's very, very successful in Colombia. Delhi tried to implement it without contextualizing, and it was utter failure. After a 6-year experiment, they just dismantled the whole system. Whereas in Ahmedabad, they tried doing it, but they did some preliminary work. They widened the road, and it's an extremely successful program. And India is a very hot country, so you need some kind of air conditioning for people to wait in the bus. If you want middle class people to use buses, you should provide that kind of facility. So they did that, and it's very successful. The number of cars in that section in that area is low. So contextualization is very, very important. The third thing is, whatever research evidence we get, we need to think of scaling up. There's no point doing some research showing success and leaving it there. It has to be scaled up. It has to be implemented widely. It has to be implemented countrywide or worldwide, for example. The next issue is sustainability. We might do something very good, but can it be sustained? Do we have funds to sustain? Do we have the resources? Do we have the financial resources to sustain? So that's a question which we need to answer. Then innovations are very useful. Innovation simply means that we try and disrupt the current thinking by a different way of handling these things and making a change. Then quality improvement programs, then awareness of everyone, populations, media, policymakers, because media has got a huge role in changing the attitudes of people. And for all this, you require a multidisciplinary framework. How are we doing this? We need to work in the domain of policy. We need to look at health system interventions, advocacy, capacity building, and research, largely implementation and translational collaborative. I'm going to largely talk about health system intervention. I'm not going to talk about policy because of the paucity of time, but I'm going to talk about two important areas: health system interventions and research at the level of the health system. As you can see here, This is a figure which is modified from Detsky, Alan Detsky, a Canadian researcher, who said if you have to address public health challenges, you have to complete this loop. He had provided this diagram as a loop. He said you start with fundamental research, do efficacy research, effectiveness, efficiency, availability, and distribution. And that loop has to be completed to address any public health challenge. We modified this to look at surveillance and epidemiology where it works. Then in terms of policy, because at every level you require policy interventions. You need fundamental research to understand disease mechanisms. You need efficacy, do it in ideal settings and see that it is scientifically credible. You need effectiveness to actually see if it works in real world settings. Efficiency, you want the biggest effect on most people, so you look at costs and other things. Without supply, you cannot get to improving health. And then you need to have diffusion of interventions. And this is the framework with which I'm going to give my talk on the research that we're doing. So some examples of addressing these challenges are establishing a robust surveillance and information system, understanding mechanisms of disease, task shifting and task sharing, mHealth and IT technology at multiple levels of care, quality improvement program, and utilizing local expertise and local traditional approaches and embedding them into the healthcare programs and increasing capacity of primary care physicians. So let me start off with one of the largest study that we are doing. It's called the CARS surveillance study. CARS stands for Center for Metabolic Risk Reduction South Asia, and that's the title of our group. So that's called CARS surveillance study. It's one of the largest cohort model surveillance study in South Asia. The way we have actually designed this study is that we recruit certain number of people in the first year and we follow them up as a cohort. At the end of 5 years, in the same area, we'll recruit another group of people so that you get both cohort data as well as surveillance data. At a system level, what are the changes that have happened? At an individual level, you get cohort data. So we have recruited so far 17,000 individuals from representative communities of Delhi, Chennai, and Karachi. All of these, I should say, are large megalopolis or metropolitan cities. We have recruited 20 plus years, both genders, stratified for residence and location using a complex cluster sampling design so that we make it representative and providing adequate sampling weights. We have several demographic, behavioral, anthropometric, and blood measurements done. Blood samples have been collected, and we have stored something like 16 aliquots of biological samples in long-term storage, extracted DNA out of them. It's a huge platform for young researchers and has several policy implications. We have completed baseline survey in 3 follow-ups in all the locations, and we started the second phase, as I said, because we need it for surveillance, so that our cohort will expand to 32,000 people in these large cities. Then we have a rural cohort in north of India, which is 40,000 participants, but blood in only 8,000 people. Because of the funding issues, we could collect blood of only 8,000 people, but all these 40,000 people will be followed up. The third cohort is in transitioning cities, because when you look at the epidemiological transition, it is also dependent on several factors like economic transition, demographic transition, and others. And one of the things which increases the risk for chronic diseases is how we move from an agrarian society, rural society, to a highly advanced city dweller. But there are cities which are in between, a rural location and a urban, highly urbanized location. So you need to look at them, and we are doing this in 2 cities. So these cohorts have the potential to provide Framingham-like data and have huge biorepositories that can help the understanding of the mechanisms of disease. In addition, we have embedded large number of small sub-studies. One of the things we are using is Geographical Information System. For those of you who do not know, I think everybody here would know Geographical Information System. It's computerized data management system used to capture, store, manage, retrieve, analyze, and display spatial information. And it's used in disease mapping, geographical correlation studies, risk assessment in relation to a point or line source, and cluster detection, disease clustering. So in our areas where we have the cohort, we have geocoded the households so that we know where each person is living. And we have actually mapped out the availability of parks, green spaces, traffic density on the roads, the alcohol outlets, food outlets, distance from the hospitals and healthcare providers, so on and so forth. So this is kind of technical. I'm not getting into the details of this, but we created areas and buffer zones so that we can get all the data in that within that buffer zone and actually link it to individual level data. So you can look at households which are within 1 mile of hospitals. Do hospitals increase or decrease mortality? We don't know. So we have this households within 1 mile of alcohol outlets. Does it make you, if an alcohol outlet is very close to your residence, are you likely to get more addicted to alcohol or not? So that's an issue we can look at. Density of fast food joints and BMI levels. We have some preliminary data to show here. So this is an area which we consider a low physical activity cluster. It's actually a slum where there's hardly any place for walking, no green area around that. And that same area, when you measure the blood pressure, it's a high systolic blood pressure cluster. What we mean is it's higher than the mean of that city. So similar is the fasting blood sugar. Low physical activity cluster correlates with, you might say that there are a lot of confounders. Yes, there are, but these are preliminary but exciting data to look at. And then now we have been funded by NIH through a U grant to look at outdoor air pollution. So we're putting in these air pollution monitors in relation to the households and looking at future incidence of cardiovascular disease. So this is about our surveillance, but let me briefly talk on innovative translational research. So I just listed out the things that we are doing. The Empower study was done in Himachal Pradesh, where frontline health workers and nurses and using mobile phone or tablets at community health centers, which are higher than a primary healthcare center, but largely rural location, to look at control of blood pressure and diabetes. The other is Uday is a study which is being done in Haryana and Andhra Pradesh. It's a comprehensive intervention package at community and health system level. The SIM card study was published recently in Circulation. I can send the paper to you. Looks at the role of frontline health workers and nurses at PHCs and community level for management of hypertension. The MWellCare trial, which is funded by Wellcome Trust, looks at frontline health workers at primary health care centers in HEML to integrate multiple risk factors such as depression, alcoholism, hypertension, diabetes, smoking together. The community health worker identifies and provides integrated care. Then we also should not ignore tertiary care and secondary care, and the CARS-T is a tertiary care and secondary care trial where we are developing a whole cadre of physician assistants to support the physicians in terms of providing care for diabetes, and I'll share some of the results from that study. So going back to our WHO goals, 25-25 goals, we started the study around 2-3 years back. So we asked a question, can we reduce high blood pressure burden in India by 25% in the next 12 years? So what we did was, we looked at task shifting. Task shifting simply is allocation of tasks in the health system delivery to the least costly health worker capable of doing that task reliably. But what I particularly don't like task shifting because many people feel really threatened by task shifting. They say, you're going to take away our job. So we call it task sharing. Right? The second one is, we're trying to shift some of the tasks from specialists to non-specialists and primary care physicians. Like hypertension, diabetes should not be managed by specialists unless there's a complication. A common garden variety of hypertension should be managed by a primary care physician. Then from physicians, we further wanted to shift the task to healthcare workers, nurses, pharmacists, and then frontline health workers. But the issue is there are very few trials. If you do a systematic review, there are only 4 studies which have done this, and they're very small studies. They're mostly proof of concept. And you require good trials to scale it up. And this is a given. I won't get into why we need task shifting. Obviously, all of us know that doctors are overloaded. They don't have the time to talk to patients. But why mHealth Technologies? The McKinsey and company was asked to look at some innovative methods to improve the GDP of nations. And they gave mHealth Technologies number 4. It has got the potential of saving $12 trillion over the next 20 years if implemented properly. So for consumers, there's improved convenience, more active engagement in self-care and greater personalization. For clinicians, it decreases the demands on time and refocuses on the art of medicine. And it has the potential to change every aspect of healthcare environment, delivering better outcomes and substantially lowering costs. So what we did between February to September 2011 was develop this. We did a systematic review. We developed the mHealth decision support system and electronic health record. We did beta testing and validation through various research processes, which include qualitative research, comparison against experts, because this was needed. We needed to know how the decision support system functioned. For example, in this comparison, suppose there's a patient who walks into a clinic, has a blood pressure of 160 by 100. What should be done? So the decision support gives an output saying that amlodipine 2.5 milligram to be started, or it would say measure the blood pressure again in the next 15 days. So we gave the same scenario to experts, some 100 scenarios to experts, and drew this ROC curve. And we got a agreement of almost 0.84, area under the curve of 0.84, which is very good. Anything above 0.75 is considered good. 0.84 is very good, showing the congruence between the decision support system and the experts. Next is a trial, but you have to do a trial in a gold standard. Instead of doing it in community health workers, we did it in doctors, in primary healthcare physicians. This is a cluster randomized trial amongst 16 primary healthcare centers in Andhra Pradesh. That time, this was in Andhra Pradesh. Now it's in a state called Telangana because that has been divided. But as you can see here, at the end of 1 year, there's a substantial reduction in diastolic blood pressure. Substantial reduction in systolic blood pressure and some reduction in diastolic blood pressure. So this worked. Now next is to take it up to community health workers. But before taking to community health workers, we needed to do an economic modeling to see whether it's really worthwhile doing that. So Tom Gaziano from Harvard and I had done some previous modeling studies to see what would be the gain if we use community health workers for hypertension management. With a 3-day programming, we said that there will be a gain of $700,000 in terms of hospital savings per million population, prevent 700 cardiovascular deaths per million population, prevent 750 hospitalization for stroke or MI, and if the annual salary of the community health worker dropped below $3,500, it would be cost saving to the economy. And given the fact our community health workers get just around $1,200 per year, this is likely to be a huge cost saving exercise. So with this in mind, we developed a mHealth program where we looked at sustainable evidence-based decision support-enabled healthcare delivery model for the management of hypertension and diabetes at community health centers in Himachal Pradesh. It's a beautiful location in the north of India, but these are the settings where our community health workers are working. And this is a screenshot of the questionnaire that we used. This actually took almost 2 years because we started with 44 questions and nobody was using it. They refused to use it. So we told them, look, we'll give this to you. You tell us which questions, and if it agrees, then we will keep them. But if we disagree, we'll come to a conclusion. So we reduced it to 22, and that took 10 minutes per person, so they were happy to use it. And this is a screenshot, not from this, from the other, from some other study. So the screenshot comes like this. This is a patient of diabetes who's come for, I think, 3 follow-ups. So at the end of the 3rd follow-up, the blood sugar is still very high. The HbA1c is high. So the decision support system says, likely poor control, review the glucose levels and titrate insulin. But we provide flexibility to the doctor because the doctor can override this. Now the doctor has written, I saw the patient. The patient had gone for some wedding for 2 weeks. In India, they go away for 2 weeks. Didn't take the insulin with him and forgot to take insulin. And that's the reason why we are having this. So I've asked the person to take the same, continue the same treatment. In terms of hypertension, it says continue with the existing regimen, and the doctor agreed. In terms of LDL cholesterol, he said the decision support system said increase the dosage of statin by an increment, but the doctor chose to have a diet control. So you can see that it gives you appropriate advice, but you really require to talk to the patient to get the right treatment. You can't blindly follow this, so you need both the approaches. So with this, we looked at over 82,000 clinic attendees in the 6 community health centers, and of which we said there were nearly 17,500 who were eligible. By eligible, we mean that anybody above the age of 30 years coming to the clinics for any reason, there could be headache, gastroenteritis, fever, whatever, they should have 1 blood pressure measurement and 1 blood sugar measurement. So because of this, you can see we detected almost 6,000 people with hypertension and 1,500 people with diabetes. But point to note is, newly detected hypertension and newly detected diabetes was in the range of 50%. So if not for the screening system, people would have gone out of that system. Then one might say you did screening, but is it ethical to screen in a low resource setting when you're not going to give anything? So we spoke to the state government and said, look, these are the guidelines which you have made. You said this is the Indian public health standard. These two simple drugs have to be there in the clinics. These two simple drugs for diabetes have to be there in your clinics. Just please ensure that they are there. That's all we want you to do. So they agreed. And so at 3 months follow-up, you can see a steep fall in the blood pressure, steep fall in diastolic blood pressure. And for diabetes also similar, I'm not showing it here. But it was sustained over a period of 1 year. So this came as a big surprise to us, but we looked at multiple ways to see whether this is true or not, and indeed this is true. But one thing you might say is that it is only the people who are coming back to the hospitals you are capturing. There are some people, nearly 1,000 people who did not come back. So what do you do to them? So we had a different design for them. We asked the community health workers to go to their houses and bring them into the clinic or provide them the drugs. And that's a study which is published in Circulation. It's called the SIMCART trial. The idea was to pilot test and evaluate the feasibility and effectiveness of a simplified but guideline-based CVD management program delivered by community health workers or community health volunteers at a community level. And it was done in Tibet, in China, and Haryana, and India. And again, it was a cluster randomized trial. And here it was process outcomes. We just wanted to look at how many people are actually taking the antihypertensive drugs that are prescribed. So it was a little different in China and in India. In India, because of the ethics committee stipulation, we had to provide the drugs in the control villages too. In China, they didn't have to provide. So in China, they got a better result than us. So the primary outcome is, we achieved primary outcome both in India and China. I'm just showing one result, but in India also we achieved the primary outcome, but in terms of the change in blood pressure, the Chinese population had a better change in blood pressure. It was significant, statistically significant. In India it reduced, but it was not statistically significant. The third issue in terms of hypertension and diabetes management is behavior change. People say behavior change is difficult, as this cartoon says, don't tell me to improve my diet, I ate a carrot once and nothing happened. So behavior change is very, very difficult. People think that you just have to do minor changes and things will improve. Again, we designed a cluster randomized trial where we are using community health workers who work in antenatal care and immunization. So they go to the houses of people, women for antenatal care, and also go to in families where there are newborns, provide them immunization. So we told them, can we do an additional, we'll pay you a little bit extra, do an additional task of going to every household 9 times for an 18-month period and talk to them about hypertension. We gave them the props that are required. So we did a baseline evaluation in the control and intervention villages. We have done the intervention. We are in the phase of getting the end-line evaluation done. And if it makes a change, we can embed this in a policy program. So I'm not getting into the details because these are the details of the study. But just to show some pictures, it's not only at the level of the individual. We have programs at the level of the household, at the level of the at a mass level, and in fact we have given them oil dispensers and salt spoons, so that in India there's a habit of while cooking, people take salt by the hand and put it, or they pour oil while frying. So we said use a calibrated spoon and a calibrated measure for oil, and look, and we said it won't change the taste, so we could look at differences later on. And there are several things that are being done, and these are all women from the village. So they meet in a place, they discuss the strategies of how to go to the houses, what to talk, and in fact they have changed their lifestyles, so they find it easier to implement. So this is as far as the primary healthcare setting is concerned. What do you do at the tertiary healthcare level? So we have a physician assistant training program. So we know in India there's very poor risk factor control in patients with diabetes. Nearly only 50% of people achieve targets, and eye examinations are done only in 16% of the people annually. Foot examinations very, very low, and self-management advice is low. Smoking counseling is only to the tune of 8%. These are published studies from India which show that. So you need to improve the quality of care in secondary care and tertiary care hospitals. So there are several factors which impede care delivery. There are patient level factors, provider level factors, and system level factors. And we need to intervene at the level of process of care to improve intermediate biological outcomes, to ultimately reduce target organ damage, reduce CV events, and reduce mortality. So this is a multifaceted approach for quality care improvement, and it's a coordinated multifaceted strategy where we have employed nurse case managers and have provided some enhanced self-mix in the care, provide tracking and reminders through this IT-based decision support system, physician audits and feedbacks. There's a multidisciplinary team, provide structured care and stratify these patients. So the process of care is improved, there's better intermediate biochemical outcomes and better patient satisfaction. So this is how the intervention flow which happens normally. Patient comes to the clinic, goes to the registration, goes to the lab, goes to the physician, and then goes to billing. So what we did is we added a human element, a care coordinator, who actually follows up the patient, provides lifestyle advice, provides reminders, and does a lot of other additional work, becomes a friend of the patient, kind of. And we also enabled these care coordinators, the decision support system and an EHR for providing feedback and providing reports on the patient. So this is the result that we have got. We are writing it up. In the intervention group, the multiple risk factor control was achieved. The primary outcome was achieved. HbA1c targets less than 7% again was achieved. The blood pressure targets were achieved. Lipid, there was not major change. And quality of life score was better in the intervention group as compared to the control group. And the diabetes treatment satisfaction scores were better. And one of the things which worries most people is, will physicians accept this? The physician acceptance was quite high. For diabetes, for glucose targets, it was not that high because these are all endocrinologists. So they would say that we would like to do it. But for blood pressure and lipids, which are more important than blood sugar control, it was very high. It was to the tune of 80% or so. So the acceptance by the physicians were high. And some of the reasons why they didn't accept were real, because they talked to the patient and found something else. So it is not that they just rejected it out of hand. So it was found extremely useful. So this is a new system where we could have care coordinators assisting physicians to improve outcomes in diabetes. Putting it all together, you require a comprehensive approach, and you require a demonstration project for the government to take it up, and that's what we are doing with this program called Uday, which is being done in 4 sites in India with a population of around 400,000. I'll just summarize the innovations here. So here there's a prevention, early detection, referral. So there's a health promotion and screening. So there's a mass campaign for people to come for screening. Then there's capacity building and task shifting of healthcare providers. And so we have short training programs, distance learning, and quality improvement programs for them. Then we want to look at diagnosis and prevention of complications, and we have created a community-based registry of 10,000 patients who will be followed up. Then there's a ML system for electronic data system and decision support system. There's electronic data capture through tablets, and this is for the baseline and inline evaluation. Then there's spatial and built environment assessment through GIS mapping. The improved access by social marketing initiatives so that there's improved quality of service. We're using pharmacists here because pharmacists are actually one point of contact for patients. And pharmacists could provide lifestyle advice, and we are incentivizing pharmacists to provide lifestyle advice when people come to purchase drugs. And we actually know whether they have done that or not, because they have to fill up something on the mobile phone when they do it. And we have feedbacks from the patient. So then there's culturally tailored patient education and networks for enabling care. So this study is ongoing, and we'll get the results in the next 2 years. Now moving on, one low-hanging fruit for us is people who have disease. People who have had a heart attack or stroke is a real good target, because intervening in them with simple measures actually increases survival, reduces complications, which is not done that frequently. So it has the ability to prevent almost 20% of deaths and hospitalization the first year after a heart attack. There's a large scope for improvement. Only 10% get adequate secondary prevention in low-income countries, as what Dr. Salim Yusuf showed in his PURE study. And there are several approaches. Polypill is an approach. I'm not going to talk about it. There's quality improvement programs, use of traditional approaches, creation of virtual health clinics, and universal health coverage. And I'm just going to give you 2 innovations here. One is, after a heart attack, you require cardiac rehabilitation. And for a cardiac rehabilitation, you require a doctor, you require some nurses, physiotherapists, you require a room as large as this with a lot of equipments. So we decided that we'll use yoga care instructors, because we thought yoga care instructors can provide all these things, and yoga can do all the things that the equipment can do. So what is the aim of a cardiac rehabilitation program? Stress reduction, improved physical fitness, and lifestyle change. The yoga care also provides the same thing. Stress reduction through breathing exercises and fitness through yogic postures. And yoga care is a package of lifestyle change, because as per yogic traditions, you're not supposed to smoke and have alcohol and etc. So, and moderate your diet. So with that aim, we are doing a 4,000 patient study. It's a randomized controlled trial in 25 hospitals in India. But this actually opens up new vistas for us. Could you look at yoga care for stroke or difficult to treat diabetes? Yoga in palliative care of cancer patients, yoga in the prevention of injuries, particularly the elderly. So lots of opportunities it opens up. The second innovation in terms of secondary care is quality improvement. Just simply using a checklist, for example, Atul Gawande's principle of checklist. So we are trying to implement that through a cluster randomized stepwise design. It's a special trial design where if ethics is involved, we actually randomize people according to the time. So some people get in initially, then next group would get subsequently, and so on and so forth, and we would do the comparison based on the time when they got in. So it has the potential to improve in-hospital quality of care in Kerala, also pre-hospital care, post-hospital care. It can be used in other disease states and can be extended to other Indian states. So it has the potential to contribute to the largest shift of evaluating the effect of cardiovascular quality interventions using a stronger study design. This is one of my mentees who came from US, Mark Huffman. This is his K99 grant, and he's doing it in India. The last issue is integrating chronic care, which is a Wellcome Trust funded trial. It's again a cluster randomized trial of 24 PHCs involving 3,600 participants from Haryana and Karnataka, which is a South Indian state. So we are looking at the changes in 10-year cardiovascular risk, systolic blood pressure, and HbA1c levels. I'll finish off with some futuristic technologies. This is one of my colleagues who's developed something called a health kiosk. The idea was that at villages, people should not go to hospitals. Rather, they should have access for diagnosis. So we thought if we create a kiosk and keep it in a village, the person goes in and sits there, puts his arm and the blood pressure gets measured, puts his finger, gets his blood sugar and blood cholesterol done, and gets a score, and then gets a report, and then says that you need to go to the hospital. So we are testing this out in a big hospital in South India. It actually takes 8 minutes per patient to do this. At the end of it, the patient has a report and goes to the doctor. The doctor's time is saved. So this is being evaluated. So there's a small trial going on. The second is for people who are living in remote villages. How do you give them care? An example is anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation. And when people take anticoagulation, it's very important to control their INR. And they find it difficult because they have to go to a nearby city, get their test done, then they have to go to the doctor. This whole process may take a week. And by the time the damage is done, either they are on a very high anticoagulant level or they are on a very low anticoagulant level. The idea here is that you have a point of care device, train them to do the test, and embed a Bluetooth device into the point of care device. And the Bluetooth device can talk to a virtual clinic where a nurse is sitting. She would get the report. She would call the patient and say, okay, you increase or decrease your anticoagulant. This was turned down by NIH, but we are looking for funding from other sources. Then there are several other health technologies which can make lifestyle change fun. You want people to enjoy lifestyle. It should not be a core. So there are some motivational therapy units with gaming technology which can be done. One of my colleagues is trying to develop this. This costs around $2,000, but he says the contraption can be done in $50. And we can give it to clinics where they can, diabetic clinics where they can put this. Patients can come during their free time in the mornings or evenings and exercise on this. Then the other thing is development of point of care devices, which is being done. One of my it doesn't work with me, but somebody in Bangalore has uses the phone jack and a small connecting device as a point of care device for measuring 8 parameters. So there are several innovations that are taking place. And in fact, the gaming technology has better angulation for the knee, is more safe on the knee. So there are lots of things, because we're training people on, pre-exercise, I'm forgetting the word. I mean, the okay, anyway, before actually exercising, they have to condition. I'm not getting the word conditioning. So pre-exercise conditioning is they provided training, so it's much better for them. So what are the other areas of innovation? We need trials on salt substitution because it's a controversial area. Community organization for physical activity, harnessing traditional approaches for several diseases, pollution and cardiovascular disease. We have been funded recently to look at air pollution and organic pollutants in diabetes and cardiovascular disease, technology evaluation, health technology assessment, microfinancing for health catastrophes, policy evaluation. These are all in the portfolio. Various people are doing studies on these. Last but not the least, we need to increase human resource capacity, because we need to re-educate primary care physicians on chronic disease. There's nothing much that happens during undergraduate training, and they're not provided enough information and enough experience to handle chronic diseases when they graduate. So we have created on-job certificate courses, distance learning, innovative learning tools through case studies and IT tools, and creating networks for peer education. One of the largest courses, this is a flagship course, it's called the Certificate Course in Evidence-Based Diabetes Management. The idea is to develop skills and competencies amongst primary care physicians for the practice of evidence-based diabetes management, and to establish robust referral linkages through networks between primary care physicians and existing specialized diabetes care centers in India. It's a very simple model where the person is asked to spare a Sunday a month, and over a 12-month period, we deliver all the necessary curricula during this 12 courses. There's a pre-test and a post-test, and they have to pass an exit exam, and there's a robust monitoring. So our monitors go and visit all these places where these courses are conducted. There are in fact 165 centers in 87 cities in India which are conducting these courses. And we also have a IT-based monitoring system. So nobody can say that I've conducted the course and not conducted the course. And we also have talked to these people qualitatively. There's in-depth interviews with the participants. So it started with around 100 centers, and in the first year we had 1,208 primary care physicians. In the current year we have 2,350 primary care physicians being trained. So all in all, you can see the reach. This is the whole of India where the centers are there. And it's being done in 25 states, 91 cities, 165 centers. And this is the profile of the participants. The number of faculty is around 250. There are 100 observers for the quality control. Then the 32 national experts who are developing this program. And so far we have trained 11,300 physicians. The idea is to reach in as many diseases as possible. We have started courses on hypertension, cardiovascular diseases. And this is a very simple model with pharma funding, of course. But to make it self-sustained, we are trying to get this into a long-distance module. We can do it on Sundays. So as I showed this first slide, this is the whole range of research that's required, and I showed some examples of what we are doing to actually cover all the things that are required to reduce the burden of cardiovascular disease in India. So I would want to end with this quote. Toni Morrison is an African-American author who wrote this book called Song of Solomon, in which he says, if you don't create the future, the present extends itself. And we don't want that. That's what we are trying to do. Thank you. I'm sorry if I've gone a little over time. No?
We have time for a few questions, so if anyone has questions or comments or thoughts. Dr. Ram.
I had a very enjoyable and productive visit in Cochin, Bangalore last December, which is also cardiovascular, and I was impressed that senior cardiologist there, I think it was Amrita Hospital chain, quite active, not just
Amrita is Cochin, not Bangalore.
Cochin,
yeah.
In their own place, but in collaboration with the national or state health departments. They had a major budget, maybe possibly tied to yours, on the in Andhra Pradesh or someplace in the center.
Oh, I know. You're talking about George Institute, India. They have the Andhra Pradesh program. Yeah.
I'm just pleased that you mentioned the polypill. That was about 20 years ago. A British epidemiologist recommended this, Nick Hall, I think.
Yeah.
And has it been picked up any places? Is it being used? You know, this model that you presented could be done in Detroit.
Yep.
It should be done in Detroit, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of a highly sophisticated and expert approach. The question is, how much can we do on a mass public health scale for the vast majority of the target population?
So the polypill question to answer, I think polypill has fallen into a little bit of controversy. After the one thing is Law and Wald's estimate was really an overestimate, and it was over-optimistic about the role of polypill. The second issue is in secondary prevention, there's no question. Polypill would be extremely useful in secondary prevention. We did a trial called the Umpire, where we showed there's a 33% higher adherence, and this was done in India, Netherlands, Ireland, and UK. And sister studies were done in New Zealand called Impact and Kenini Gap in Australia. So we are going to publish pooled data of that, and it shows that adherence really improves. There are minor issues. There are issues in that because the polypill that we used was based on off-patent generics. The doctors are very reluctant to use that. They say that these are old drugs. How do you know it is going to benefit my patient? We want the newest drug possible in this.
Lord.
So that's one.
With all their unknown side effects.
Yeah. The second issue is the drug company itself. The drug company which funded the trial, actually the drug company didn't fund the trial, they provided the drugs, but the drugs, the funding was provided by European Commission. The drug company promised to manufacture on a mass scale and give it at 15 euros per month in Europe, and something like almost 2-3 euros per month in India, as low as that. Then they worked out the maths and they said it doesn't work, so we are not going to manufacture the polypill. They have given the copyright to one of the investigators, Anthony Rogers. He's in New Zealand. He's talking to, or he's creating his own company to do this polypill. So for secondary prevention, there's some scope. Primary prevention, there's a controversy, because should we give aspirin in everyone? That's one issue that's not been addressed. Second is, they said folic acid should be used, and we now know folic acid is useless. The third issue is, are we medicalizing the population? Suppose, let us say there is a smoker, 55-year-old man. His vascular risk is likely to be very high. Should that person be put on polypill, or should the person be asked to stop smoking? So that's a philosophical issue which we are grappling with.
Either or. Does everybody know what polypill is?
Yeah.
Good.
Michelle?
Oh, thank you so much for this tremendous work. Thinking about task sharing, which your work has shown can be so effective, as well as V. Patel's in depression and anxiety,
Yeah.
GOAS, and the lay health workers throughout Pakistan. As you think about really training lay health workers to really go out and do behavioral counseling, what are your thoughts on the necessary training? I know the lady health workers, they've developed condensed cognitive behavioral therapy training. V. Patel has talked about how they've developed motivational interviewing. I mean, certainly the behavioral training is important. What are some of your thoughts on how you manage that at a large, scalable level?
See, Vikram's study was more intense, and he's very successfully shown its role in mental health, management of mental disorders. He actually co-directs the center with me.
Yes.
But the issue here is on a large scale, how do you train people? In a study like what Vikram did, it's likely to be easier. He had a week's training or so, but we had to compress the training to 3 days because government employees will not come. The government will not allow them to go for a training or spend time away. So you have to have methods of working with the government, not taking away too much of their time, focusing on the most important things. And we created a 3-day training program. 1 day it's only didactic. Then there's a role playing by people. So you get them to measure blood pressure on volunteers, talk to them, teach them how to talk, ask questions, those kind of things. So it's a mixed model of didactic role play, case studies, and all that.
And do you include booster trainings? Do you have the initial 3-day, and then do you have what kind of follow-up?
So we didn't do the booster training. Actually, booster training is required, but given the funding, that whole study, was $1 million for 36,000 patients and 36 centers. So obviously, we didn't have that kind of funding to do. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about the non-certified physicians that are in the rural areas. And has there been any discussion with kind of partnering with some of these non-certified physicians to give them the same training that you're giving these community health workers, or to utilize them in any part?
That's the aim, actually. we would want them to be involved because they are in any case they are there. You can't wish them away. But the biggest problem is the medical lobby, the Indian Medical Association and others. So right now we are very successful because we have not done anything about that. So they're cooperating with us, they're doing, but most associations, the Cardiology Society of India and the Endocrine Society of India are upset with our primary care physician training program. They're saying you're creating half-baked cardiology. We said that's not our aim. We are saying that in fact, there's a disclaimer in our certificate saying that this is not recognized by the Medical Council of India. This is just a certificate. But that insecurity is there.
Your jet ski model that you showed at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of what you focused on was the efficacy and effectiveness of what you showed us today. How are the state and national governments responding to the evidence that you're bringing forward? Where are you finding them willing to invest in scaling and sustaining what you find works, and where are you meeting resistance from the government because it's too costly or too difficult to implement?
Actually, the government started the National Program for Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease, Diabetes, and so they're grappling with how to implement that program. What are the areas which need to be strengthened? So, in fact, in the program itself, there's an additional manpower. So the issue of financing that manpower is not a problem. And we have done a business model for the decision support system. For the private sector, it will cost around 40 cents. Whereas for the government system, we'll give it free of cost. So they're happy with that. We are in dialogue with the Himachal Pradesh government to actually implement it all across Himachal Pradesh, and there's going to be a meeting sometime next month. So the issues are, they say that we would like to integrate it with other diseases like tuberculosis, which is a problem, and others. So they're grappling with how to do that. But one of the advice given by the chair of that committee to me personally, he says, you're making people dependent on by giving all the support. You should just provide them the technology and be a technical support if for problems that may arise with the technology, but don't hold hands with the government. Just give it to them, let them do it, because you will go away somewhere and they have to implement it. So every time they cannot come back to you. So that's one new lesson that I learned.
Yeah, please run. Right.
So the work that you have done is totally impressive. Considering Vineet and I, we are from India, we understand how difficult all this is. And following on a very similar question, how are you able to manage the politics between the center, state, and how are you able to do all this? Give us some words of advice.
Lots of
So I believe in this statement. I don't know who said this. Politics is the art of possible. So we start with that. And the most important thing is you have to be non-threatening. You have to say that you are not going to take over somebody else's bread and butter. And you have only a pure academic interest. That's one. So I'm quite popular with the Cardiology Society of India because they almost think that I'm not a cardiologist, so they're not worried. so you pretend you are an epidemiologist in cardiology circle, and in public health circles you pretend to be a cardiologist. So nobody feels threatened. The second thing is it's important to have a dialogue with people, and it takes some efforts actually. But once you have shown in one area, then it comes. It's got the Matthew principle in effect.
And one quick question. And so we have a lot of young trainees in the room who are looking at what you've done and are grappling with their own projects and how they actually get things done. And they see this and the jaw drops. Wow. And even for me, not only have you done a variety of different research projects, which is very impressive, but you've used very different methods, very different analytical approaches. So I guess this is a two-part question. One is, what advice do you have for young trainees who are thinking about their careers in respect to sort of the scale that you've described? And second, if anyone were to want to engage with India, how may you see that in developing given what you've just discussed?
So I really don't know what advice to give, but I think one of the advice I was given was think big, start small. Think global, do it locally. So these are the two important advice which I got, and I use that to the fullest extent. So we start off with small projects and use multiple resources, be entrepreneurial, get resources from here and there and scale it up into a big project. That's one. But in terms of working with us, anyone is welcome to work with us, and there are mechanisms by which you can get funding to work. Actually, we had a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar, and I think through that also they had one person coming and working. But Fogarty Fulbright Fellowship is the best method. It gives you around $60,000 salary. It gives you two travel costs covered, and then gives you some research funds. So it's quite generous. It's almost around $100,000 for that year. And we have these big research platforms. You can do any amount of work. But the most important thing is when you come to India is to embed within the group and be part of the group and not question how it's going to be related to me. Never ask the question how and what, but focus on the why. Why am I doing this? I want to be a global health leader, I'm doing this, but I'll do scut work if required. That should be the...
Thank you very much.